All right, today we're going to dive into a pretty radical idea about technology. And honestly, it was decades ahead of its time. It's a totally different way of thinking about how we build the tools that, run our entire lives. It's called the Scandinavian Approach.
So let me ask you something. Have you ever been using a piece of software and just thought to yourself, who in their right mind designed this thing? You know the feeling, right? You're forced to completely change how you work, you're clicking through what feels like a million menus, and you have to learn this totally illogical new process just to do a simple task. It really feels like the technology is the boss, and we're all just supposed to fall in line.
And that contrast really gets to the heart of a fundamental divide. On one side, you've got tech as this rigid tool that's just imposed on you from the top down. But on the other, it's a flexible partner, something that's actually designed with you to serve your needs. And believe it or not, this whole debate, it's not new at all. In fact, the roots of this more human-centered approach, they go back decades. And that's what brings us right here. See, back in 1989, a group of German researchers published this study called Out of Scandinavia. They'd found a place where the entire philosophy of building technology was just different. And they weren't just making this stuff up. They weren't theorizing. No, they were documenting a real, powerful movement that was already happening. So what do you say? Let's kind of follow in their footsteps and go on this quest for a more human way to build our tech. You see, their whole mission was driven by this one simple but honestly really profound question. They looked at how software was usually being built back then, with these rigid requirements, completely ignoring the social context of it all, and they just wondered, is there a better way? A way that doesn't start with the machine but starts with the actual person who has to use it? And what's really interesting is that their search for answers didn't take them to Silicon Valley or any of the big tech hubs of the day. Nope, it led them to Scandinavia. They did these deep dives, these field trips into the work that was happening in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And this is the really fascinating part, right? Why there? What was so special about that place? What was it about the culture that made this region the perfect breeding ground for a totally different way of thinking about technology? Well, it turns out the answer wasn't in the code at all. It was in the unique cultural soil that allowed that code to grow. This quote from the paper, wow, it just gets right to the heart of it. The researchers realized that in Scandinavia, building software wasn't just a technical problem. It was a social one. The goals weren't just about efficiency or making more money. The goals were, and I'm quoting here, humanization and democratization. I mean, those values were just baked right into the core of their society. And these roots, they run deep. This wasn't some new fad. The paper actually points to centuries of history. Think about it. Centuries ago, the absence of feudalism in places like Norway and Sweden meant cooperation was valued way more than hierarchy. Then in the 19th century, there's this conscious shift toward peace and social progress. And after World War II, the whole focus was on rebuilding a society with a high quality of life for everybody. So by the time we get to the 1950s, it just made sense to see technology as a tool to help achieve all of these big social goals. So all that history created this really unique foundation on the ground. You had a culture that was just really good at negotiation and solving problems together. You had strong, cooperative trade unions that were seen as partners in innovation, not as roadblocks. There was this amazing tradition of workers, employers, and scientists all collaborating. And maybe most importantly, there was this shared fundamental belief that technology could and should be a force for good in society. Okay, so now that we have all that context, let's actually define what this Scandinavian approach really is. At its core, it's really about two key things. First, humanization, the idea that tech should work for humans, not the other way around. And second, democratization, which just means giving the people who actually use the tools a real say in how they're made. I mean, it sounds simple, but it was absolutely revolutionary. And let's be super clear here, this was about so much more than just being user-friendly. This was about a fundamental shift in power. It was about moving that power away from just the engineers and the managers and giving it to the people on the front lines, the workers, the clerks, the nurses, the people whose day-to-day lives were going to be completely shaped by these new systems. This really shows you how the role of the user evolved. So in the traditional way of doing things, the user is just a passive recipient. You build it, you give it to them, end of story. A little better is when the user becomes an information source. You might interview them for their input. But the Scandinavian ideal, that was a whole different level. The user becomes an active participant, a true co-designer who's involved right from the very beginning. Here's a great analogy. Think about building a house. You would never let an architect design your family's home without ever talking to you, right? Of course not. They have to work with you to understand how you actually live. Well, this approach basically takes that same exact logic and applies it to building the digital houses that we all work and live in every single day. Okay, so that's all fascinating history. But how on earth does a paper from the 1980s connect to our world today with AI, smartphones, and, being connected 24/7? Well, it turns out that what was so radical back then has actually become the blueprint for what we now consider best practice. This deep, deep concern for the human side of tech didn't just stay in Scandinavia. It planted the seeds for a massive global movement. I mean, its principles are the direct ancestors of things we talk about all the time now. User-centered design, user experience, or UX research, participatory design. All of these fields owe a huge debt to this pioneering work. Heck, even the modern conversations we're having about ethical tech echo the exact same core values from all those years ago. And this is why this whole thing is more relevant than ever. Back then, the big challenge was figuring out how to introduce computers into the office in a humane way. Today, the stakes are infinitely higher. We're introducing AI and automation into every single part of our lives. The technology has changed, but the fundamental questions, they are exactly the same. The authors of the original paper actually called it the Scandinavian Challenge. They saw their approach as a challenge to the rest of the world. And now, as AI and all these other powerful new technologies are reshaping our society, that challenge from over 30 years ago feels more urgent than ever. So the question for us is, are we ready to accept it? Are we going to build technology for people, or are we going to keep asking people to bend and break themselves to fit the technology? That's the challenge we all have to face.